thinking about how coronavirus and the lockdown is changing the way people eat, shop for food and cook food in the east of England. Now, we know this is an important topic to look at the moment because coronavirus and the lockdown are kind of serving to exacerbate existing income and health inequalities. So families, households that are experiencing hardship before are likely to find themselves in a worse situation, and then some people who weren't having a bad time before are having a bad time now, financially and in terms of their health and in terms of their well-being. So of course people's food and diet is going to be affected by that. And there's been a lot of interest publicly about what's happening with food around COVID. So from the beginning of the lockdown, when there was a lot in the media about possible food shortages and panic buying in supermarkets, and then as it's carried on to look at free school meals and food parcels, it's what's happening in food banks. So this has been an ongoing theme of COVID and the lockdown, has been what's happening with food. So this is something we're looking at currently at the University of Hertfordshire and with other partners in the region. So we're doing a study funded by the NIHR through the ARC East of England, looking at how COVID and the lockdown is shaping food practices across the life course in the East of England. Now, the East of England is an interesting area to focus on because it's quite diverse in terms of income. There's very wealthy pockets and then quite deprived populations in there, and it covers coastal regions, urban and rural. So there's a lot of diversity there. And we started this study at the beginning of May. And it's a qualitative study, so it means we're not necessarily getting people to do surveys. We're speaking to people on the phone, having long conversations about them, or by video call and asking them about their experiences and what they think's happening. And we're going to speak to quite a lot of people. So by the end of the study, we're aiming to have spoken to about 100 East of England residents, so we know what's going on in about 100 households. And we also want to speak to around 60 people who are supporting, either in a voluntary or professional capacity, efforts to feed people. So they might be working in local authorities or food banks or charities or for schools. So we've got quite a holistic picture of what's going on. And there's some emerging findings that are coming out as we speak to more people. And some of that are things that you might expect. So as the lockdown continues, it becomes apparent that it has the potential to really trace those fault lines around health and income inequalities and into dietary inequalities. So kind of pushing the poles apart between who's able to eat well and who's not able to eat well, and kind of embedding and pushing that further apart. So if you think about people who are maybe furloughed with a reasonable chance of knowing that they can go back to work afterwards, or people who are fortunate enough to be able to work at home despite the inconvenience, so they've got a relatively stable income over this period, so not much insecurity about that, and they're in adequate accommodation with access to adequate cooking and food storage facilities, and they're not somewhere overcrowded, and they're safe. The lockdown has been a period for some of those people to really focus on food and their dietary health and try and make it a priority. So they're trying to frame it in a positive way, much as some people are with kind of exercise or physical activity, and say, I'm going to take this opportunity to try and improve my diet and that of my household. So that can be things like cooking from scratch more, trying to prioritise eating fresh food more. If you go to the shop every day as part of your daily exercise, bringing fresh food in anymore, choosing to stop buying certain foods that they class as unhealthy. So the temptation's not there anymore. If you're not commuting and you're not going into work and you're not physically doing the school run, you're not eating them foods on the go. So if you don't bring them into the house, you can't eat them in the first place. And then not commuting can save a bit of time, and you can spend that and structure your day around healthy meals and about spending time cooking. maybe getting other members of the household cooking who haven't been, trying new recipes, trying new things, trying to get people cooking and eating together more, making family meal times more of a priority if you live with other people. So there's all sorts of positive things and changes people are trying to make around food while they have to be indoors. So as we come out of the lockdown, are those people going to have their dietary health improved? Are they going to be eating better and more healthily, and are they going to be able to carry those practices into post-lockdown life and find that it's been a boost for their dietary health? So could something good come out of it in those terms? I know lots of the people we've spoken to think that maybe it could. On the other hand, you've got other people we've spoken to who are not so fortunate with their income. So they might have difficulty claiming benefits, they've become unemployed, or they might be in receipt of benefits that aren't going far enough, and for them the lockdown has made it even more difficult to eat a healthy, acceptable diet. So for the first time they may be having to use food banks, which can be a traumatic experience for some people. If they've used food banks before, they may have returned to that or have to start doing that more regularly. Might have government food parcels coming in, or food from charities. And when you're getting food come in that you haven't chosen, or that's charity or donated food, there are all sorts of well documented issues with that. So is that food you would want to eat? Is that food you can eat? Have you got the facilities to store it and then cook it, or the skills to eat that, cook that particular food? Is it culturally appropriate for you? And as an adult, for short periods, we can make ourselves eat food we don't like, even if we have to, but that's much more challenging if you're trying to get children to do that, especially if you're trying to get children to do that in the long term. There's been lots in the press about free school meals and picking up food that replaces free school meals, and how difficult or that easy that is to kind of make that into meals for children. So these are all things that are going to make it more difficult to feed your household. It could be that you don't have adequate access to a kitchen and to food storage facilities if you live somewhere overcrowded, especially if you live in temporary accommodation. You might just have a kettle and some access to an oven some of the time. Like, how do you do this if before that you've been relying on eating outside of the home a lot? If you live alone and you're elderly and you've been isolating, you may not have eaten a shared meal or shared anything, even a cup of tea, with anyone for months and months and months, and that is not good for well-being. And that can serve for some people to start deprioritising food, or to feed into feeling down and isolated and sometimes depressed. And then after a while, how important does food become to you? Do you lose interest in food and just eat enough to sustain yourself without enjoying it? So you might just start eating biscuits and tin soup and crisps because it's just sustenance. And as the lockdown goes on and the months pass by, that would have a greater impact on health. If you're relying on somebody else to do your shopping for you, again, these are more things that take away your agency with food. So you might be getting some food through food parcels. You don't really have any choice in that or much. If you send someone else out to get your food shopping, then that's been mediated by someone else, and people say that they don't want to be a bother and they don't want to cause too much difficulty or ask for too many things. So that means you can end up with food that's maybe not the food you want or you'd normally eat, or not enough. And then there's a difficulty of access to fresh food if other people are shopping for you. If you're getting food parcels as well, are you getting enough of that? Are you able to access it? And are you still interested in cooking and eating it after a certain amount of time? All of these things make it difficult to eat enough. So we've spoke to participants who say they've either put on or lost weight because of this, and not in a way that they'd set out to do. This has happened incidentally as a result of their practices and as a result of their coping strategies that they're just using to get by. There's been a lot in the press about people drinking more alcohol during lockdown, and this is something we're asking questions about as the interviews carry on, and how people might be using alcohol to kind of differentiate between home as a workspace and then home as a leisure space, because you're in the home all day. So do you have a drink at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock when you wouldn't normally, to mark that it's the end of your working day? Or is some of it in order to cope with being indoors? There are all sorts of things that go around that as well. I think it's also been interesting to look at the types of food people focus on from different groups and different backgrounds, and the type of foods people are worried about not being able to get, and that's a real marker of difference. So again, for some people there's been a lot of complaints about not being able to get flour, because people are passing the time indoors by baking more, by making their own bread or their own cakes, and then trying to get other family members, especially children, involved in this. So for a while it's been very difficult to get hold of flour. Whereas other people we've spoken to are saying it's very difficult to get hold of fresh vegetables or formula milk, which speaks of a very different type of need and something much more immediate. So on the one hand, you've got shortages of things that are nice as food to pass the time and for leisure and creativity, largely, and then the other hand, food that meets very basic needs around your health and feeding yourself and your family. When we speak to people who organise and volunteer at food banks, some of the things that they're worried about in terms of shortages are instant mashed potato and long life milk, because those are the things that they can give to people that won't go out of date, that they can fill up on, that will provide sustenance, and that at some stages in the lockdown have been very hard for them to get hold of. So you can see, depending on what type of foods you're worried about or what type of foods you're prioritising to try and get hold of, that reveals something about the social scale and the difference in concerns we have across the social gradient with food. And then there's also the ones that have come up in the press and sparked popular interest, like whether or not you should buy Easter eggs, and whether or not people feeling guilty about pushing the trolley around and buying Easter eggs when they thought they should only be buying essentials. So it impacts on our eating culture, it impacts on what we think of as acceptable, and it impacts on our cultural rituals. There's also been some particular challenges that have been spoken about local efforts to try and feed people and make sure that, in particular, vulnerable people get fed. And some of that is just around unprecedented levels of need. So people in food charities and food banks and working for local authorities and councils just saying about how much need there is and how many people need to be reached and need help with food. And the more marginalised or vulnerable groups might have been pre-lockdown, unfortunately means during lockdown they're even harder to reach. So how do you make sure people who are eligible for free school meals can still access that in some altered form if they've had to go and live somewhere else during the lockdown, if they haven't got enough credit to put on their phone, if they haven't got access for the internet for you to contact them? They really are isolated. They're not contactable, and how do you get in touch with them, and how do you organise food provision for them? These are big challenges, and although a lot of creative work is being done trying to address this, it remains a challenge. In food banks, trying to deal with the sheer level of demand and need is very challenging in some areas. So they've seen the amount of referrals or need go up and up, and then if you think about food banks, a lot of their volunteers are retired, and a lot of the people who have to self-isolate are retired. So whole food banks have had to shut down or restaff or move area because their entire volunteer base has gone within a couple of days. And then when you do get new people in, then they have to be trained, and they might want to work in different ways, and then people have had to change their procedures in order to accommodate growing need or to accommodate bulk donations. So because a lot of shops had to close down that weren't food shops, that might have had large stacks of novelty chocolates or sweets or bottled water, have donated them to food banks, which is a good thing. But then it also means the food bank then has a job lot of something that they're not sure if they should give out, and they're not entirely sure where they'd store it. It creates lots of operational problems because the last thing they want to do is throw away food. So there's all these problems that kind of add up and make it difficult to feed people. And also in terms of churn and change. So COVID and the lockdown is a constantly fluctuating situations. There's difference in recommendations and practices and need that are going on all the time, and it's very difficult to keep up. So especially if you're a smaller charity that's helping to feed people, the person you might regularly deal with the council, who you liaise with, it's a very good chance they've been redeployed and they have to work somewhere else for a while, and then it's on rotation and then somebody else will come in. So again, it creates barriers. And that's not to say that it's all been negative. We've heard some positive things about local groups and local councils working in new ways and working with new partners and establishing working practices that they're really pleased about and they want to take forward, and learning lessons. And there will be lessons learned out of it. But it still remains the difficulty of feeding people in the immediate term. And one of the concerns that a lot of our participants expressed was worrying about who might not be getting fed and who might be missing out on very much needed provision and help around food. And some of the key groups that people spoke about that we'll be asking about more as the research goes on was a fear that people with addiction problems or people experiencing homelessness or both were going to be particularly difficult to feed during this time, because referral agencies and advocates who might normally put them in touch with services that could help them get fed might have had to close down or work remotely or offer a reduced service, and all of this makes it much more difficult to put people in contact with agencies and support services that are going to help them get fed and help them maintain their health. Also, if there's vulnerable people who aren't recognised as such, how they end up getting food parcels, and if there's a vulnerable person in the household who is getting a food parcel, that food parcel might be being stretched around the whole household. So what happens to other people in the home, especially children? If there's just one food parcel coming in for someone who's shielding, what happens to everyone else? And these are things that I guess are going to continue to emerge as the research goes on. So it leaves us with some questions. So when we think about how COVID and the lockdown is impacting on household food practices, we think from what's coming out of the data that it's amplifying existing dietary health inequalities, but what we want to find out more about is how this is going to change as we come out of lockdown. How many of these behaviours or different practices or engagement with donated or surplus food or spending time more cooking, the good and the bad, how much of it is going to stick? How easy or difficult is it going to be to maintain it if you want to, or to stop it if you want to? And in terms of the challenges facing local responses to food and need and helping people get fed, how much longer can local provision like this go on? How sustainable is it, and what happens when or as people stop receiving food parcels, as the emergency provision stops? How many people, because of the lockdown, are still going to be in such a vulnerable position? Are they still going to be able to access food? Thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, please contact us at the University of Hertfordshire. Thank you.